Imagine landing in Tokyo. You step onto a train, exactly on schedule. The doors close. A few moments later, you're traveling at nearly 200 miles per hour. No traffic, no security lines, no long waits at the airport, just city center to city center. Now imagine trying to do the same thing in America, the richest country on Earth, the world's largest economy, a nation that put astronauts on the moon, built the Interstate Highway System, and connected an entire continent by rail over a century ago. Yet today, America has almost no true high-speed rail. How is that possible? Why can Japan, France, China, Spain, and even countries with far smaller economies build world-class bullet trains, while America still can't? The answer goes much deeper than trains, because this isn't really a story about transportation. It's the story of how America chose to build itself. At first glance, the explanation seems obvious. America is huge. People drive everywhere. Flying is cheap. Case closed. Except, none of those explanations fully hold up. Texas alone has enough people to support multiple high-speed rail corridors. The Northeast has population density comparable to many parts of Europe. California has more people than Canada. And yet, after decades of debate, billions of dollars, and countless political promises, America still doesn't have a single modern high-speed rail network. To understand why, we have to go back. Long before highways, long before suburbs, long before America became the country of cars. Because there was a time when America wasn't built around automobiles at all. It was built around trains. And for a while, America had the greatest railroad network the world had ever seen. That history changes everything. Here's the part that surprises most people. America wasn't built for cars. It was built for trains, long before the first interstate highway, before suburbs, before families packed into station wagons. Railroads were the arteries of the nation. In the late 1800s, steel tracks stretched across the continent. Small farming towns, mining camps, and growing cities all depended on the railroad. If a town had a station, it had a future. If it didn't, it often disappeared. By 1916, America had over 250,000 miles of railroad track, more than any country in history. Passenger trains connected nearly every major city. Freight trains fueled factories. Mail crossed the country by rail. Even fresh food traveled on trains before trucks became common. In many ways, the railroad didn't just connect America. It created modern America. The influence of railroads went far beyond transportation. They determined where businesses opened, where factories were built, where families settled. Even time itself had to change. Before railroads, every town kept its own local time based on the position of the sun. That worked until trains began crossing hundreds of towns every day. Scheduling became chaos. So in 1883, American railroad companies introduced standardized time zones. The system worked so well, the entire country eventually adopted it. That's how important railroads had become. By the early 20th century, few people imagined anything could replace them. If you wanted to travel between cities, you took the train. It wasn't simply the fastest option. For many Americans, it was the only practical one. But history has a way of changing faster than people expect. A new invention was quietly becoming more affordable every year. At first, it looked like nothing more than a curiosity. Within a few decades, it would completely reshape American life. Not the airplane, the automobile, and once America fell in love with the car, there was no turning back. The automobile didn't destroy America's railroads overnight. For a while, cars and trains existed side by side. But then, something changed. After World War II, America experienced one of the greatest economic booms in history. Millions of returning veterans started families. New homes were being built at an incredible pace. And for the first time, owning a car wasn't a luxury. It became the American dream. The car promised something trains never could. Freedom, no schedules, no stations, no waiting, just get in and go wherever you wanted. Car ownership exploded, and as more Americans bought cars, cities began changing to accommodate them. Roads became wider, parking lots became larger, downtown neighborhoods were demolished to make room for highways. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1956, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act. The law created the Interstate Highway System, a network that would eventually stretch more than 47,000 miles across the country. It was one of the largest infrastructure projects ever attempted. But the highways themselves weren't the biggest story. The funding was. Every time Americans filled up their gas tanks, part of that money flowed into the Highway Trust Fund. That meant roads had something incredibly powerful, a permanent source of funding. The more Americans drove, the more money highways received. The more highways were built, the easier driving became. And the easier driving became, the more Americans chose cars. It created a cycle that reinforced itself year after year. Passenger rail never received anything comparable. There was no dedicated national fund building new rail lines across the country. Instead, private railroad companies were expected to keep passenger trains running. But by the 1950s, those companies had discovered something important. Passengers didn't make much money. Freight did, transporting coal, grain, cars, and shipping containers was far more profitable than carrying people. One by one, railroad companies began abandoning passenger service, not because trains had suddenly become obsolete, but because the economics had completely changed. By the late 1960s, private railroads were abandoning passenger routes as fast as regulators would allow. The government's answer in 1971 was to create Amtrak, a quasi-public company that would take over the money-losing passenger routes so freight railroads could focus on cargo. Amtrak was never designed to build high-speed rail. It was designed to keep passenger trains from disappearing completely, and it's been chronically underfunded ever since, surviving year to year on federal subsidies that Congress has to approve again and again, unlike the Highway Trust Fund, which runs on autopilot. By the end of the 1960s, America wasn't choosing between cars and trains anymore. It had already chosen, and that decision would shape nearly every transportation debate for the next 70 years. Ask almost anyone why America doesn't have high-speed rail, and you'll probably hear the same answer. The country is just too big. It sounds reasonable. After all, the country stretches nearly 3,000 miles from coast to coast. Building a bullet train from New York to Los Angeles would make little sense. Flying would always be faster. But here's the problem. That's not how high-speed rail is supposed to work. No country builds high-speed rail to connect every city. It succeeds by connecting the right cities, routes where people travel constantly, but flying is inconvenient, and driving takes too long. Cities somewhere between 200 and 600 miles apart. Close enough that a train can beat a plane once you count airport time. Far enough that driving stops making sense. And America has plenty of those corridors. Boston to Washington, Los Angeles to San Francisco, Dallas to Houston, Chicago to St. Louis to Minneapolis. These regions have the population density of countries that already run high-speed rail successfully. Texas alone has more people within its Texas Triangle, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, than many European countries with functioning bullet trains. So geography explains why America wouldn't build one line across the whole continent. It doesn't explain why it hasn't built rail on any of the corridors where it would obviously work. If size isn't the real answer, something else has to be. And the clearest place to see it is California. If you want to understand why high-speed rail is so hard to build in America? California is the case study everyone points to. In 2008, California voters approved a bond measure to build high-speed rail connecting Los Angeles and San Francisco. The projected cost was around $33 billion. The target completion date was the early 2020s. As of the mid-2020s, not 1 mile of true high-speed track is operating. Costs have ballooned past $100 billion for the full system. The only segment under active construction runs through the Central Valley, connecting smaller cities, not the two major metro areas anyone actually wants to travel between. Why did it go so wrong? A few reasons keep showing up. Land acquisition, unlike China or France, where the state can more easily claim land for public infrastructure. America has strong private property protections. Every parcel of land the train needs to cross can trigger lawsuits, negotiations, years of delay. Farmers, homeowners, and local governments along the route fought the project property by property. Environmental review. Infrastructure projects face extensive environmental impact studies and opponents, sometimes for genuine environmental reasons, sometimes simply to block the project, can file lawsuits that stall construction for years. Fragmented governance. The project has to satisfy federal regulators, state regulators, county governments, and city governments, all of whom have some power to slow it down. There's no single authority that can just say, build it, the way a national government can in a more centralized country. Political turnover, because funding comes in waves tied to elections and budget cycles. And because governors and legislatures change, the project has been redesigned, rescoped, renegotiated, again and again. Every shift in priorities added more cost, more delay. California became the example opponents point to. Nationwide, whenever a new high-speed rail proposal comes up, look what happened in California. Whether or not that's a fair comparison, it's now baked into the politics of every new attempt. But land and lawsuits aren't the only obstacle. There's a second problem that most people never even think about. Who actually owns the tracks? Here's a detail most people don't know. Outside the Northeast Corridor, Amtrak doesn't actually own most of the tracks it runs on. It's running on tracks owned by freight railroad companies: CSX, Union Pacific, BNSF, Norfolk Southern. That single fact changes everything, because those companies weren't built to move passengers. They were built to move freight. And the freight rail network is one of the most successful in the world. Every day, thousands of trains carry containers, cars, grain, coal, and countless other products across the country. For freight companies, those tracks are valuable business assets. They're designed to maximize cargo, not passenger speed. Technically, federal law says passenger trains should receive priority, but in reality, freight trains often control the schedule. When long cargo trains occupy the tracks, passenger trains wait, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for much longer. It's one of the biggest reasons many Americans think passenger rail is slow and unreliable. But high-speed rail can't operate that way. A train traveling at nearly 200 miles per hour can't share tracks with slow-moving freight. It needs something completely different. Dedicated tracks, no freight traffic, no road crossings, no constant interruptions. In Japan, those tracks were built decades ago. In much of Europe, existing rail corridors were gradually upgraded over time. America faces a very different challenge: building an entirely new network across thousands of miles through privately owned land, while working around one of the busiest freight rail systems on Earth. That's not just expensive, it's one of the most complex infrastructure challenges the country has ever faced, which raises an even bigger question. If high-speed rail could benefit millions of Americans, why hasn't there been stronger political pressure to make it happen? The answer has as much to do with economics as it does with transportation. By this point, it's easy to think America simply doesn't care about passenger rail. But that's not entirely true. Poll after poll shows that many Americans support the idea of high-speed rail, especially in crowded regions where traffic is getting worse every year. So if public interest exists, why has progress been so slow? Part of the answer is that America has already invested trillions of dollars into a completely different transportation system. Think about it. Highways, gas stations, parking lots, suburbs, car dealerships, repair shops, drive-through restaurants, motels, airports, entire industries have grown around the assumption that Americans travel by car or by plane. Changing that system isn't just about building a railway. It's about challenging an economy that has been evolving for nearly a century. Then there are the industries with the most to lose. Airlines, automakers, oil companies all compete for the very same travelers. High-speed rail hopes to attract. That's not to say there's some secret conspiracy. There isn't. These industries do what every major industry does. They lobby, they protect their interests, they argue for policies that benefit their businesses. Meanwhile, passenger rail has never enjoyed the same political influence. Road funding has long been built into the system. Airports receive consistent federal investment. Passenger rail often has to compete for funding. Project by project, budget by budget, election by election. And that uncertainty makes long-term planning incredibly difficult. Because a high-speed rail network can't be built one election cycle at a time. It requires decades of commitment, the kind of commitment that Japan, France, and China were willing to make. Which brings us to the biggest question of all. Is America finally beginning to change, or has the country already built itself into a future where cars and airplanes will always come first? For decades, the story of high-speed rail in America has mostly been about what never happened. Plans announced, funding debated, projects delayed, promises made, and forgotten. But recently, something has started to change. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to suggest the conversation is no longer just theoretical. In Florida, Brightline has already shown that Americans are willing to ride modern passenger trains. Its service between Miami and Orlando isn't true high-speed rail, but it has proven something important. When trains are comfortable, reliable, and competitive with driving, people use them. Now, the company is building something much more ambitious. Brightline West, a true high-speed rail line, linking Las Vegas and the Los Angeles area. Unlike California's project, much of the route follows the median of Interstate 15. That single decision avoids one of the biggest obstacles the country faces. Instead of acquiring thousands of separate pieces of land, the railway can follow a corridor that already exists. Meanwhile, other projects continue moving forward. Texas has spent years pursuing a bullet train between Dallas and Houston, modeled directly on Japan's Shinkansen technology. And in recent years, the federal government has committed the largest investment in passenger rail in decades. After generations of prioritizing highways, America is no longer asking whether high-speed rail is possible. Washington is beginning to spend serious money on rail once again. Will it be enough? No one knows. Building a true high-speed rail network will still take years, probably decades, but for the first time in a long time, it's asking where it should be built first. That may seem like a small difference, but history often changes one question at a time. And after nearly 70 years, America's transportation story may finally be entering its next chapter. For more than a century, America has been shaped by the choices it made. It chose highways, it chose suburbs, it chose automobiles. Those choices created one of the most mobile societies the world has ever seen. But every choice comes with trade-offs. Today, countries across Europe and Asia continue expanding their high-speed rail networks. Meanwhile, America is still deciding whether to build the future or continue relying on the past. Perhaps the real question was never, why doesn't America have high-speed rail? It's this: after everything that's happened, is America finally ready to choose a different path? Only time will tell.